They laughed when the sheriff took the old veteran's land. But 3 winters later, the same man returned from the mountains with enough food to save the entire town. No one in Pine Hollow expected to see Jack Callahan again. After the sheriff forced him off his ranch, most people believed the mountains would finish what the bank had started. But Jack didn't disappear. With only his loyal German shepherd Bruno beside him, he found something hidden deep in the Sawtooth Mountains, a valley no one else had ever seen. And there, against the brutal winters, he built a ranch the world thought was impossible. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from today? The winter of 1894 had been cruel even by the standards of the northern mountains. For nearly 2 months, Pine Hollow had lived beneath a sky the color of cold iron. Snow had fallen so heavily that rooftops sagged under its weight. The wind swept down from the Sawtooth Mountains like a blade, cutting through wool coats and timber walls alike. Cattle died first, then chickens. By February, the fields were nothing but white silence, and the people of Pine Hollow had begun counting what food they had left as carefully as a banker counts coins. It was on one of those brittle mornings, when the air was so cold it made a man's breath feel like broken glass in his lungs, that the stranger walked into town. The bell above the door of Ellen Parker's general store gave a tired little jingle. Inside, the stove burned with a steady orange glow, and 3 townsfolk were gathered around it with their hands outstretched to the warmth. A farmer named Ben Hollister was complaining about the loss of half his herd. Another man sat quietly whittling a piece of pine. No one paid much attention when the door opened. Travelers passed through now and then, but the room fell quiet anyway. The man who stepped inside looked like he had come from somewhere far colder than Pine Hollow. His coat was heavy canvas, darkened by snow and long use. Frost clung to the gray stubble on his jaw. His shoulders were broad but slightly bent, as though the weight of years had settled permanently there. Behind him padded a large German shepherd. The dog moved with a calm, deliberate confidence that drew the eye immediately. Thick fur, black and sable, dusted lightly with snow. Amber eyes that missed nothing. The dog paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room once before stepping in beside the man. Ellen Parker glanced up from the counter. "Morning," she said automatically. The man nodded once but didn't answer. Instead, he walked slowly toward the counter and set down a wooden crate. It was the kind of crate farmers used for produce in the fall, but this was February. Ellen frowned slightly as he untied the rope. The lid lifted. For a moment, no one spoke. Inside the crate were bundles of green kale wrapped in cloth. Fresh eggs nestled carefully in straw. A block of pale yellow butter sealed in wax paper. The smell of it drifted across the counter. Rich, sweet, unmistakably fresh. Ben Hollister lowered his hands from the stove. "Now hold on," he muttered. He stepped closer. "That can't be right." Ellen reached out and picked up one of the eggs. It was warm enough that a faint trace of steam fogged the cool air. "Where'd you get these?" she asked. The man finally spoke. "Up north." His voice was low, rough around the edges, like a door hinge that hadn't moved in a long time. Ben stared at the crate. "Up north?" he said. "Up north there's nothing but rock and snow." The German shepherd sat quietly beside the man's boots, eyes fixed on the door, watching, guarding. Ellen looked more carefully at the stranger now. The beard, the weathered face, the deep lines at the corners of his eyes. Recognition arrived slowly, like the dawn pushing through a storm. She blinked, then leaned forward across the counter. "Jack?" The man looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ellen's hand slowly lowered the egg back into the crate. "Jack Callahan?" she said softly. The farmer beside the stove turned sharply. "No." But it was. 3 years earlier, every person in Pine Hollow had watched Sheriff Gordon Pike ride out to Jack Callahan's small ranch with a folded piece of paper and 2 deputies. 72 hours later, Jack had left town with a single horse, a few tools, and the big German shepherd that had once served beside him in the army. No one had seen him again. Some said he'd frozen in the mountains. Others believed he'd wandered south and died somewhere along the rail lines. But no one had ever expected to see him walk back into Pine Hollow. Certainly not with fresh vegetables in the dead of winter. Ben Hollister rubbed the back of his neck. "Jack Callahan," he said slowly. "You're supposed to be dead." Jack didn't react. He simply pushed the crate a few inches forward across the counter. "I'd like to trade," he said. Ellen blinked again. "Trade?" "Flour," Jack said. "Salt. Coffee, if you've got it." Ben gave a short laugh that held no humor. "You come back from 3 years in the mountains with green vegetables and butter," he said. "And you want to trade for flour?" Jack's gaze didn't move from the counter. "That's right." Silence settled over the store. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Ellen slowly folded her arms. "You grow these?" she asked. Jack nodded once. "In February?" Ben said. Jack didn't answer. The German shepherd shifted slightly, ears pricking toward the door again. Ellen looked at the dog. "That Bruno?" she asked. Jack's hand reached down automatically, resting briefly on the dog's head. "Yes." Bruno's tail moved once against the floor. Ellen turned back to the crate. Fresh kale, eggs, butter, food that shouldn't exist this time of year. She let out a slow breath. "All right," she said finally. "Let's see what we can do." But even as she reached for a sack of flour behind the counter, Ellen Parker couldn't shake the feeling creeping quietly through the room. Because there was only one question anyone in Pine Hollow could think about now. 3 years ago, Sheriff Pike had taken Jack Callahan's land. The mountains beyond Pine Hollow were nothing but frozen wilderness. So how, after everything he had lost, had the old veteran come back with a crate full of food that no one else in the valley could grow? Jack lifted the flour sack onto his shoulder. Bruno rose silently beside him, and without another word, the man everyone thought was gone forever walked back out into the cold morning. The bell above the door rang again. Ben Hollister stared at the empty doorway for a long time. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "Whatever he's doing up there, it shouldn't be possible." No one answered Ben Hollister. The words hung in the warm air of Ellen Parker's store like frost on a window pane. Outside, the wind moved through Pine Hollow with a low, restless howl. Snow lifted off the roofs in thin white veils and drifted down the empty street. Inside the store, Ellen stood still for a moment, staring at the door Jack Callahan had just walked through. Then she shook herself and began measuring flour into a sack. But her mind was somewhere else. 3 years earlier, Jack Callahan had been one of the quiet fixtures of Pine Hollow. Not friendly exactly, not unfriendly either. Just quiet. The kind of man who nodded when you passed him on the road and said little else. He lived on a small spread about a mile east of town where the land dipped toward Coldwater Creek. It wasn't the biggest ranch in the valley, but the soil was good, and the creek ran steady even in the dry years. Jack kept a modest herd of cattle, a few chickens, a vegetable patch behind the cabin. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't attend church often. But every morning, just after sunrise, people in Pine Hollow would see the same sight. A tall man walking slowly across his pasture, and beside him, the big German shepherd. The dog had come back from the war with Jack. No one in town knew exactly where Jack had fought. Some said it was overseas. Others said he'd served in several places. Jack never spoke about it. But sometimes, late at night, people living near the edge of town heard him shouting in his sleep. Once, during the county fair, a wagon wheel had cracked loudly in the street. The sharp report echoed like a rifle shot. Jack Callahan had dropped to the ground before anyone understood what had happened. Bruno had stood over him immediately, barking once, fierce and sharp, until Jack slowly pushed himself back to his feet. After that, people understood something about him. Not everything, but enough. Bruno was more than a dog. He was the one thing standing between Jack and whatever ghosts had followed him home from the war. During the day, Bruno rarely left Jack's side. The dog moved through the ranch like a soldier on patrol, alert but calm, watching the tree line, listening to every sound in the wind. Children in Pine Hollow learned quickly that Bruno was gentle if Jack was near, but cautious if strangers approached too quickly. Still, the dog had never bitten anyone, and over time, people grew used to the pair of them. Jack Callahan and the big shepherd, the quiet veteran and his shadow. The ranch itself had been built slowly, over the course of several years. Jack had cut the logs himself. People passing on the road would sometimes see him splitting firewood or repairing fence posts, while Bruno lay nearby in the grass, watching with steady amber eyes. The land wasn't perfect. Some parts were rocky. But Coldwater Creek watered the lower pasture, and that alone made the place valuable. More valuable than Jack had realized. Ellen Parker remembered the first time Leonard Shaw had come to town. The banker arrived in a polished black carriage that looked strangely out of place on the muddy roads of Pine Hollow. He was a thin man with narrow shoulders and careful manners. At first, people welcomed him. A bank meant loans. Loans meant opportunity. But Leonard Shaw had not come alone. Sheriff Gordon Pike rode into town 2 weeks later. Pike had been elected sheriff 3 years earlier, a tall man with sharp features and a reputation for enforcing the law exactly as written. He believed rules were rules, and once something was written on paper, it became truth. It didn't take long for the two men to become friends. Ellen had seen them more than once sitting together at the back table of the saloon, speaking in low voices. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. But things began changing the year the drought came. That summer, the valley turned brown. Grass dried in the pastures. Coldwater Creek shrank to a narrow ribbon. Cattle grew thin. Farmers began visiting the bank. And Leonard Shaw was always happy to help. He offered loans for feed, loans for seed, loans for repairs. The papers were simple, the signatures easy. But winter came early that year. Snow buried the valley before most ranchers could recover. And when the payment deadlines arrived, Leonard Shaw began calling in the debts, one by one. Some men paid. Some sold livestock to cover what they owed. Others simply lost their land. Ellen Parker remembered the morning Jack Callahan walked into the bank. He had removed his hat before stepping through the door. Bruno had waited outside on the wooden porch. Inside, Jack had spoken quietly with Leonard Shaw for nearly half an hour. No one else heard the conversation. But when Jack stepped back onto the porch, his face looked older somehow. Bruno stood immediately, pressing his head against Jack's leg. Jack rested a hand on the dog's neck. For a long time they stood there together. Then Jack walked slowly down the street without speaking to anyone. That had been the beginning. A few weeks later, Sheriff Pike rode out to the ranch. Everyone in Pine Hollow knew what that meant. The sheriff's wagon carried papers, and papers meant trouble. Ben Hollister remembered watching the whole thing from his fence line. Pike and 2 deputies dismounted in Jack's yard. Jack came out of the cabin. Bruno followed. The dog stood between Jack and the men in the yard, silent but tense. Pike unfolded a piece of paper. Even from a distance, Ben could see the moment Jack understood what it said. His shoulders sagged slightly. He didn't argue, didn't shout. He simply nodded once. The sheriff spoke for a few minutes longer. Then he mounted his horse and rode away. 3 days later, Jack Callahan left Pine Hollow. Ben remembered that morning clearly. The sky had been gray, snow falling in slow, steady flakes. Jack loaded a few tools onto an old bay horse. A rolled blanket, a canvas bag, not much else. Bruno waited beside the gate, watching everything. When Jack finally mounted the horse, he turned once to look at the cabin, the land, the fence line, all the things he had built with his own hands. Then he nudged the horse forward. Bruno trotted beside him. They rode north toward the mountains, and by the time the storm closed over the road behind them, Jack Callahan was gone. Most people believed they would never see him again. But now, 3 years later, he had walked back into Pine Hollow, carrying winter vegetables no one else could grow. Ben Hollister rubbed his chin slowly. Across the store, Ellen Parker tied off the flour sack and set it aside. Neither of them spoke, because the same thought had settled into both their minds. Jack Callahan had disappeared into the Sawtooth Mountains with nothing. And somehow, he had come back with something the entire valley could not produce. Outside, the wind moved across the snow-covered street. Far to the north, beyond the last ranch fence and the final line of pine trees, the mountains waited. And somewhere in those mountains, Jack Callahan had built a life no one in Pine Hollow understood. Yet. But to understand how that could possibly be true, you had to go back to the year everything began to fall apart. It started with the drought. The summer 3 years earlier had been the driest anyone in Pine Hollow could remember. By July, the grass in the valley had turned brittle and pale, crunching under a man's boots like old paper. The wind carried dust instead of the usual scent of pine. Coldwater Creek shrank to a narrow ribbon of slow-moving water. The banks cracked and dried under the relentless sun. Cattle wandered through the fields, searching for grass that wasn't there. Jack Callahan watched it happen day by day. He didn't complain. Men who had seen war rarely complained about weather. But every morning he walked the pasture with Bruno beside him, studying the land the way a soldier studies a battlefield. The cattle were getting thin. The pasture wasn't recovering. Jack had enough feed stored to last maybe 2 months. After that, things would get difficult. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the pine ridges, Jack sat on the porch of his small cabin with Bruno lying beside his boots. The dog lifted his head as Jack flipped through a worn leather notebook. It had belonged to Jack's father. Inside were rough sketches and careful notes about soil, rock, and water. Observations made over decades of working land that had never been easy. Jack's father had always said the same thing. Land would give you a living, but only if you respected how stubborn it could be. Jack closed the notebook slowly. The drought wasn't something respect could fix. Across the pasture, 2 of the cows moved slowly toward the creek, ribs showing beneath their hides. Bruno stood and walked to the fence line, watching them quietly. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. He had one option left, and he didn't like it. The next morning, Jack rode into town. Pine Hollow was busy that day. Farmers were already lining up outside the Frontier County Bank. The new bank building stood near the center of town, its painted signs still bright against the wood siding. Inside, Leonard Shaw waited behind a polished desk. The banker looked up as Jack entered. Leonard Shaw had the careful smile of a man who measured every word before speaking. "Mr. Callahan," he said pleasantly, "what can I do for you today?" Jack removed his hat. "I need a loan." Shaw gestured to a chair. "Of course. Sit down." Jack sat stiffly, his hands resting on his knees. "I need feed," he said simply, "for the herd." Shaw folded his fingers together. "How many head are we talking about?" 15. Shaw nodded slowly. "That's manageable." He opened a ledger and began writing neat figures in the margin. "And you expect the herd to recover next season?" "Yes." Jack's answer came without hesitation. The land had always come back eventually. The drought wouldn't last forever. Shaw slid a sheet of paper across the desk. $200, he said. "That should cover feed and transport." Jack studied the paper. The terms were printed in small, careful type. "Payment due by January 1st, Shaw added lightly. Jack frowned. "That's only 6 months." Shaw smiled again. "Standard practice, I'm afraid." Jack hesitated. Outside the window, he could see Bruno lying on the porch, watching the street. The dog trusted him. The cattle depended on him. If he did nothing, the herd would die before autumn. Jack picked up the pen. His signature was slow and deliberate. Leonard Shaw's smile widened slightly as he took the paper back. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Callahan." At the time, Jack believed him. For a few weeks, things improved. The feed arrived. The cattle began regaining weight. But the valley never recovered the way Jack had hoped. The drought stretched longer than anyone expected. Grass grew back slowly. By October, Jack had sold 2 cattle just to keep the others fed. Then the early snow came. The storm rolled down from the Sawtooth Mountains without warning. It buried the valley under 3 feet of snow in less than 2 days. The cattle couldn't graze. Feed costs doubled overnight. Jack spent the rest of his money keeping the animals alive. He worked from sunrise until dark, repairing fences, hauling feed, and breaking ice in the creek. Bruno followed him everywhere, moving through the snow like a silent shadow. But winter was merciless. By December, Jack knew something was wrong. The numbers in his ledger didn't add up anymore. Even if the herd survived, the market price wouldn't cover the loan. Still, he believed he had time. The note said January 1st. He would sell cattle in the spring. He would settle the debt. That was how things worked. At least, that was how Jack believed they worked. The sheriff arrived 2 weeks before Christmas. Ben Hollister saw the wagon coming down the road that morning and felt a cold knot settle in his stomach. Sheriff Gordon Pike rarely visited ranches unless something serious was happening. 2 deputies rode behind him. Their horses' hooves crunched heavily in the snow. Jack was splitting wood when they arrived. Bruno heard them first. The dog lifted his head sharply, ears forward. A low growl rolled from his chest. Jack rested the axe against the chopping block and wiped his hands slowly on his coat. "Easy," he murmured. The wagon stopped in front of the cabin. Sheriff Pike stepped down. He carried a folded document in one gloved hand. "Morning, Callahan," Pike said. Jack nodded once. "Sheriff?" Bruno stood beside Jack, his body rigid. Pike glanced at the dog but didn't step closer. "You're behind on your note with Frontier County Bank," Pike said. Jack frowned. "The payment isn't due yet." Pike unfolded the paper. "The bank called the loan early." Jack stared at him. "That's not possible." Pike's voice stayed calm. "The terms allow it under certain conditions." "What conditions?" "Risk to repayment." Jack felt something inside his chest tighten. "I've paid every interest installment." The bank drifted silently through the air. Bruno's growl deepened. Jack's hands slowly curled into fists. "So what happens now?" Pike held out the paper. "You have 72 hours to vacate the property." The words settled over the yard like falling ice. Jack didn't move. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the pine trees. Then he said quietly, "This land is mine." Pike's eyes didn't soften. "Not anymore." Behind the sheriff, one of the deputies shifted uncomfortably in the saddle. Bruno took one step forward. His teeth showed. Jack placed a hand on the dog's back. "Stay." Bruno obeyed instantly, though the tension in his body never eased. Jack looked back at the sheriff. "Who's buying it?" he asked. Pike hesitated only a second. "Victor Hale." Jack felt the answer before he even heard the name. Victor Hale owned the largest ranch in the valley, and he happened to be the sheriff's closest friend. The trap had closed. Jack nodded once. 72 hours, he said. Pike folded the paper again. "That's correct." The sheriff climbed back into the wagon. The deputies turned their horses. Within moments they were gone, leaving nothing behind but wagon tracks slowly filling with snow. Jack stood in the yard without moving. Bruno pressed against his leg. The veteran stared out across the pasture he had built with his own hands. And for the first time since returning from the war, Jack Callahan understood something clearly. The battle for his land had never been fair. It had simply taken him longer than everyone else to realize it. The snow kept falling after the sheriff's wagon disappeared down the road. For a long time, Jack Callahan didn't move. Bruno stood beside him, the thick fur along his back slowly settling as the tension faded from the moment. The dog watched the empty road where the sheriff had gone, ears still raised, as if expecting the men to return. But the road stayed quiet. Wind swept across the pasture, carrying loose snow over the frozen ground. Jack finally exhaled. 72 hours. 3 days. After nearly 10 years on that land. He walked slowly back toward the cabin, Bruno pacing beside him. The small wooden house stood at the edge of the pasture, built from pine logs Jack had cut and hauled himself the year after he bought the property. Smoke curled from the chimney, drifting into the gray sky. Inside, the cabin was warm. The stove crackled steadily, filling the room with the smell of burning cedar. Jack removed his gloves and set them on the table. His hands were rough and cracked from years of work, the knuckles scarred from injuries older than the ranch itself. Bruno circled twice near the stove and lay down with a quiet sigh. Jack sat in the chair beside the table. For a moment, he simply stared at the grain of the wood beneath his hands. 3 days. The words didn't feel real. He had survived war. He had come home when many others had not. He had cleared fields, built fences, dug wells, and raised cattle on land that had once been nothing but brush and stone. And now, a single piece of paper had erased it all. Bruno lifted his head. The dog watched Jack closely. Jack reached down and scratched behind Bruno's ear. "You heard him," he murmured. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Outside, The wind rattled the window shutters. Jack stood slowly and walked to the door. The pasture stretched out in front of him, white and silent beneath the snow. The fence line cut across the field in a long, straight shadow. Beyond it, Coldwater Creek wound through the valley like a ribbon of dark glass. That creek had been the reason Jack bought the land. Water meant life. Water meant cattle could survive dry seasons. Water meant a man had a future. Jack walked out into the yard. Bruno followed. The two of them moved across the pasture slowly, Jack's boots crunching through the snow. He stopped near the fence and rested his hands on the wooden rail. The cattle stood near the creek, huddled together against the cold. They lifted their heads when they saw him. Jack studied them carefully. They were thinner than he liked, but they would make it through winter if he kept feeding them. That thought brought a bitter smile to his face. It didn't matter anymore. The cattle belonged to the bank now. Everything belonged to the bank. Bruno pressed against Jack's leg. The dog sensed something heavy in the air. Jack stood there for several minutes. Then he turned and walked back toward the cabin. Work still needed to be done. 3 days was not much time. Inside the cabin, Jack opened the small chest at the foot of his bed. Inside were the things he had carried home from the war. A folded uniform, a tin box filled with letters, and the old leather notebook that had belonged to his father. Jack picked up the notebook and opened it slowly. The pages were filled with neat, careful handwriting. Observations about soil. Notes about stone walls and drainage. Small sketches of irrigation channels. His father had spent a lifetime learning how land behaved. Jack had grown up watching those lessons. Back then, he never imagined they might one day be the only thing he had left. Bruno stepped closer and nudged Jack's arm with his nose. Jack smiled faintly. "You're right," he said softly. "No sense sitting around." The next 2 days passed in quiet motion. Jack worked from sunrise until dark. He packed tools into a canvas sack, collected his father's notebook, rolled his blankets tight. There was no point taking furniture, no point taking anything that couldn't be carried. Bruno stayed close the entire time. The dog followed Jack from room to room, watching every movement. On the third morning, the sky turned the pale gray that meant another storm was coming. Jack stepped out onto the porch. The valley looked different somehow. The snow softened the fences and the barns. Even the cattle seemed quieter. He had seen places like this before. Soldiers sometimes walked through villages the day before an army arrived. The calm always felt the same. Jack saddled the old bay horse in the barn. The animal snorted softly as he tightened the straps. "You and me both," Jack murmured. Bruno waited outside the barn door, watching the road again. The dog's loyalty had never wavered, even now, even when Jack had nothing left to offer. By mid-morning, Jack had loaded the last of his supplies: a rolled bedroll, a canvas bag of tools, the notebook, an axe. Not much else. He stepped into the cabin one final time. The stove still burned low. Jack stood in the doorway for a long moment. Every beam in the cabin had passed through his hands. Every nail had been hammered by him. The silence felt heavy. Bruno padded into the room and looked up at him. Jack rested a hand on the dog's head. Then he turned away. Outside, snow had begun to fall again. Sheriff Pike arrived shortly before noon. The wagon stopped in the yard exactly where it had 3 days earlier. Jack was already mounted on the horse. Bruno stood beside him. Pike climbed down from the wagon. 2 deputies waited behind him. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind moved through the pine trees with a low whisper. Pike looked at the packed horse. "You're leaving peacefully," he said. Jack nodded once. Pike seemed almost relieved. "Good." Jack looked past him toward the road leading north. The mountains rose in the distance, dark and cold beneath the clouds. "You ever been up there?" Jack asked quietly. Pike frowned. "In the Sawtooths?" Jack nodded. Pike shook his head. "Nothing up there but rock and snow." Jack studied the mountains for a moment. Then he said simply, "We'll see." He nudged the horse forward. Bruno trotted beside him. They passed the sheriff's wagon without another word. The road out of Pine Hollow curved slowly toward the northern hills. Jack didn't look back. But Ben Hollister did. Ben stood at his fence, watching the rider and the dog disappear into the snowfall. For a long time he remained there, the wind tugging at his coat. Finally, he muttered quietly to himself, "Man won't last a week up there." The snow thickened as Jack and Bruno rode toward the mountains. Behind them, Pine Hollow faded into the white horizon. Ahead of them, the Sawtooth Range waited, silent, frozen, and vast. And somewhere beyond those peaks, Jack Callahan would soon discover something no one in Pine Hollow had ever imagined. The road out of Pine Hollow narrowed quickly. Within half a mile, the wagon tracks faded into a snow-covered trail that wound between tall stands of pine and fir. The trees grew thicker the farther north Jack rode, their dark trunks rising like pillars from the white ground. Snow fell steadily, soft but relentless. Jack leaned slightly forward in the saddle, guiding the old bay horse carefully along the rising path. Bruno moved ahead of them, breaking through the snow with an easy, tireless stride. The dog had always loved the open country. Even in the deep cold, he moved like he belonged there. The air changed as they climbed. Down in the valley, winter had been bitter. Up here, it felt sharper, cleaner, colder in a way that went beyond temperature. The mountains did not care whether a man was prepared. They did not notice if he survived. By mid-afternoon, Pine Hollow had disappeared completely behind the tree line. Jack did not look back. The road ended at a narrow ridge where the trail split. One path turned west toward an old logging route. The other wound north into the deeper Sawtooth backcountry. Jack reined in the horse. Bruno stopped ahead of him and turned back, ears raised. Jack studied the northern trail. The wind pushed fine snow across it, erasing the faint tracks of animals that had passed earlier in the day. "Guess that's us," Jack murmured. He nudged the horse forward again. The trail climbed steadily through the trees. As evening approached, the sky darkened to a pale iron gray. Jack knew the signs. Another storm was coming. He found a small clearing sheltered by thick pines and dismounted. Bruno immediately began circling the area, nose low to the ground, checking the perimeter the way he had been trained years ago. Jack unsaddled the horse and tied the reins loosely to a branch. Then he gathered fallen wood and built a small fire. The flames crackled softly, pushing back the cold just enough to make the clearing feel less hostile. Bruno returned and lay beside the fire, his body angled toward the dark forest beyond the light, always watching. Jack unrolled his blanket and sat with his back against a tree. The firelight flickered across his face. For the first time since leaving Pine Hollow, the silence allowed his thoughts to catch up with him. They came quickly. Too quickly. The crack of the fire shifted into something else in his mind. A rifle report. The whisper of wind through branches became the distant echo of artillery. Jack's breathing slowed. then tightened. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he was somewhere else entirely. Smoke, mud, men shouting in the dark. His hands curled into fists. Bruno was beside him instantly. The big shepherd pressed his body firmly against Jack's side, grounding him. The warmth of the dog's thick fur pushed through the rising panic. Jack's breathing steadied slowly. He rested his hand on Bruno's neck. "I'm all right," he whispered. Bruno didn't move. The dog stayed there until the tension left Jack's shoulders. Only then did he settle back down near the fire. The storm arrived after midnight. Wind roared through the mountains like a living thing. Snow swept across the clearing in blinding waves. Jack pulled the blanket tighter and fed the fire carefully through the night. The old horse stood with its back to the wind, head low. Bruno remained awake most of the storm, ears twitching at every shift of sound beyond the trees. Morning came slowly. The world had changed again. Snow lay nearly 2 feet deep across the clearing. The sky cleared to a pale blue that made the mountains appear sharper and more distant. Jack stretched stiff muscles and stamped warmth back into his boots. Bruno shook the snow from his coat and trotted ahead of the trail as they moved on. The terrain grew rougher as the day passed. The trail climbed over rocky ridges and dipped into narrow valleys where frozen streams cut through the land like veins of glass. Jack kept moving north. He had no real destination, only distance. Distance from Pine Hollow. Distance from the ranch that was no longer his. By the third day, the snow had stopped falling, but the cold deepened. At midday, the horse slowed. Jack slid down from the saddle and walked beside it, easing the burden. Bruno trotted ahead again, nose moving constantly across the snow. The dog paused suddenly, his ears lifted. Jack noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" Bruno turned and looked back at him. Then the dog moved off the trail. Not far, just a few yards, but it was enough to make Jack stop. Bruno had always trusted his instincts. If the dog left the trail, there was a reason. Jack followed. The ground dipped gently between 2 rock outcroppings. A narrow stream wound through the trees, its surface half frozen. Bruno walked along the edge of the water, studying it carefully. Jack crouched beside the stream. The ice was thinner here, and something else caught his attention. Steam. Faint but unmistakable. He leaned closer. The water wasn't completely frozen. In fact, a thin ribbon near the bank moved freely beneath the ice. Jack touched the water with his gloved fingers. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't as cold as it should have been either. He stood slowly and looked upstream. The stream disappeared into a narrow fold in the mountains, where 2 walls of granite rose steeply on either side. Bruno had already started walking that direction. Jack hesitated only a moment. Then he took the horse's reins and followed. The ground sloped downward gradually. The trees grew thicker for a short distance, then suddenly they opened. Jack stopped. Before him lay something he had not expected to find anywhere in the Sawtooth Mountains. A narrow valley hidden between towering granite walls. The place was almost invisible from above. Steep cliffs blocked most of the wind. The stream ran through the center, and near the base of the eastern wall, something remarkable was happening. Mist drifted slowly into the cold air. Jack walked closer. The source became clear. A spring. Water flowed directly from a crack in the rock face, clear, steady, and warmer than the stream itself. The snow around the spring had melted into a patch of dark, exposed earth. Bruno stepped onto the ground and sniffed carefully. The soil was soft beneath his paws. Jack knelt and pushed his hand into the dirt. It gave easily, even in the heart of winter. Jack looked around slowly. The cliffs shielded the valley from most of the wind. The spring fed the stream continuously, and the ground near the water was not frozen. He could feel the idea forming even before he understood it fully. The mountains had hidden something here, something small but powerful. Jack exhaled slowly. "Well," he said quietly. Bruno sat beside him, watching his face. Jack looked down at the soft earth again, then back at the granite walls. The valley was silent, protected, almost secret. And for the first time since leaving Pine Hollow, Jack Callahan felt something unfamiliar rising inside him. Possibility. He stayed there for several minutes, kneeling in the soft ground beside the warm spring. The steam drifted gently upward into the cold mountain air, curling like breath in winter. Bruno circled the small clearing, nose working carefully across the earth. The shepherd moved with quiet purpose, as if already inspecting what might become their new territory. Jack pushed his hand deeper into the soil. Even a few inches below the surface, the ground remained loose. Not frozen, not solid like the rest of the mountain. Jack slowly stood. He looked up toward the cliffs surrounding the valley. The granite walls rose nearly straight up on three sides, towering above the trees like silent sentries. The only entrance was the narrow path they had followed along the stream. From above, the place would look like nothing more than another fold of rock and forest. Hidden. Jack walked slowly across the small valley floor. The area wasn't large, perhaps 200 yards across at its widest point. The stream wound through the center, fed by the warm spring spilling from the rock wall. Snow still covered much of the ground, but patches of dark earth appeared near the water, where the warmth had melted it away. Bruno stopped near the base of a pine tree and looked back at Jack. The dog's tail moved once. Jack understood that look. "Yeah," he murmured quietly. "I see it too." He knelt beside the stream again and studied the flow of water. If he could redirect even part of that warm water, he glanced down at the leather notebook tucked inside his coat. His father's notes. Careful sketches of irrigation channels, stone barriers that held warmth in the soil. Jack had read those pages 100 times growing up, but he had never imagined using those ideas in a place like this. He pulled the notebook free and flipped through the worn pages. Bruno sat beside him, watching the forest. Jack found the page he remembered. A rough drawing showed water flowing through shallow trenches across farmland, warming the soil just enough to extend the growing season. Jack looked up again at the steaming spring, then back to the valley. The idea formed slowly, like something waking after a long sleep. If he could guide the water across the valley floor, the warmth might keep sections of soil from freezing. Plants could grow earlier, maybe even during winter. The thought sounded impossible, but then again so had surviving the war. So had building his first ranch with nothing but borrowed tools and stubborn determination. Jack closed the notebook. "Well, Bruno," he said quietly. The dog tilted his head. "Looks like we found ourselves a place." Bruno wagged his tail. The first task was shelter. That night the temperature dropped well below zero. Jack gathered fallen branches and built a lean-to against the base of the granite wall where the rock blocked most of the wind. The fire crackled steadily through the night. The warmth from the spring drifted faintly across the valley, softening the cold air around it. Bruno slept lightly beside Jack, lifting his head at every unfamiliar sound beyond the trees. The mountains were never completely silent. Branches cracked under the weight of snow. Distant owls called through the darkness. Somewhere, high above the cliffs, a lone coyote howled. Jack slept only a few hours. Old habits from the war rarely allowed deeper rest. Before dawn, he woke and stepped outside. The sky above the valley had cleared completely. Thousands of stars filled the blackness. The cold air burned in his lungs. Bruno joined him, standing close. Jack looked across the valley floor again. Steam drifted gently from the spring, and in the faint starlight, he could see where the snow had melted into small patches of exposed earth. That ground could grow something. The thought settled into his mind firmly now. By morning, Jack had already begun planning. The next days were filled with work, hard, constant work. Jack cut branches and small pine trunks, building a stronger shelter against the cliff wall. He stacked stones from the stream to create a windbreak. The horse grazed on sparse grass beneath the snow where Jack cleared small patches. Bruno spent his days patrolling the edges of the valley. The shepherd seemed to understand that this place mattered now, that it was home. On the fourth day, Jack began digging. The ground near the spring was soft enough for his shovel. He carved a narrow trench from the spring toward the center of the valley. The work was slow. The soil grew harder the farther he moved from the warm water. But the trench began to take shape. When he finally broke open the small channel and allowed the spring water to flow into it, Jack crouched beside the trench and watched. The water moved slowly through the narrow path he had cut. Steam rose where it touched the colder ground. Bruno stepped carefully beside him. Jack laughed softly. "Look at that." The water continued its quiet journey across the valley floor. Jack knew it would take weeks, maybe months, but the idea was no longer just an idea. It was real. The mountains had given him something no one in Pine Hollow had ever seen. And slowly, piece by piece, Jack Callahan began turning that hidden valley into a place where life could survive even the harshest winter. But the mountains were never generous without demanding something in return. Jack would learn that lesson soon enough. And when the first true test came, it would not be the cold that nearly killed them. It would be something far more dangerous waiting in the dark forest beyond the valley. The mountains gave no warnings. Winter in the Sawtooths arrived quietly, then all at once. Within 2 weeks of finding the hidden valley, the storms returned. Snow piled high along the granite walls, wind roared above the cliffs, though very little of it reached the valley floor. The stone barriers protected the small pocket of land, like a bowl hidden inside the mountain. Jack worked from sunrise until darkness swallowed the trees. Each day he widened the trench, carrying the spring water across the valley floor. He shaped the channels carefully, remembering the sketches in his father's notebook. The warm water flowed slowly but steadily. Where it touched the soil, the ground softened. Where the ground softened, life had a chance. But winter still ruled everything. Food was already becoming a concern. The small supplies Jack carried from Pine Hollow were nearly gone. Rabbits moved through the trees, leaving delicate trails across the snow. But they were quick and cautious. Jack managed to catch 2 during the first week using simple snares. It wasn't much, but it kept them alive. Bruno helped in ways Jack had never expected. The shepherd tracked movement through the forest with incredible precision. More than once, Bruno froze suddenly beside a patch of brush, staring silently until Jack spotted a rabbit hiding beneath the branches. The dog never lunged wildly. He waited, patient, disciplined, the way he had been trained years ago during his service alongside soldiers. By the second week, Jack had built a more solid shelter against the cliff. He used pine logs, stone, and packed earth to create a small cabin wall that blocked most of the wind. The fire burned nearly all day inside. The warmth from the spring helped keep the nearby ground from freezing completely. One afternoon, while clearing snow from one of the irrigation channels, Jack noticed something small pushing through the soil. A tiny green shoot. At first he thought he imagined it. He knelt closer. The fragile plant had broken through the dirt where the warm water passed beneath. Jack stared at it for a long moment. A single plant, in the middle of winter. He laughed softly, almost in disbelief. Bruno approached and sniffed the small sprout. Jack reached out and touched the leaf gently. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like we're not finished yet." But the mountains were watching. 3 nights later, the valley changed. The moon rose bright and clear above the cliffs. The snow reflected pale silver light across the trees. Jack had just added another log to the fire when Bruno's head snapped upward. The dog didn't bark. He didn't move, but every muscle in his body tightened. Jack saw it instantly. "What is it?" Bruno stepped outside the shelter. Jack followed. The night was silent. Too silent. Then he heard it. A distant howl. Long. Low. Answering calls followed from deeper in the forest. Wolves. Jack's eyes moved slowly across the tree line. The mountains held many predators, but wolves rarely hunted close to fires, unless they were desperate or hungry. Bruno's growl rumbled quietly. Jack rested a hand on the dog's back. "Stay close." The fire burned brighter as Jack added more wood. For a while, the howls faded into the distance. The valley grew quiet again. Jack relaxed slightly. Then Bruno moved. The shepherd suddenly rushed forward toward the edge of the trees. "Bruno!" Jack grabbed the rifle leaning beside the shelter and ran after him. The dog had already disappeared into the darkness. Jack followed the sound of movement crashing through the brush. Then he saw them. 3 wolves had crept along the far edge of the valley, drawn by the smell of animals and fire. They froze when Jack stepped into the open. Their eyes glowed pale in the moonlight. Bruno stood between them and the shelter, teeth bared. The wolves circled slowly. Jack raised the rifle. But the distance was close, too close. One wolf lunged suddenly. Bruno met it head-on. The collision happened in a blur of fur and snapping teeth. Jack fired a shot into the air. The crack of the rifle echoed violently off the granite cliffs. The wolves hesitated. Bruno fought fiercely, driving the attacking wolf backward. Another wolf darted in from the side. Jack fired again. This time the shot struck the ground near their paws. The wolves finally broke. They retreated into the darkness of the forest. But the fight had already taken its toll. Bruno limped toward Jack. The dog's fur was dark along his shoulder. Jack knelt quickly. Blood stained the thick coat where the wolf's teeth had caught him. "Easy," Jack murmured. Bruno wagged his tail weakly. Jack carried the dog back toward the shelter. Inside the firelight, he cleaned the wound carefully using melted snow and a strip of cloth torn from his shirt. The bite was deep but not fatal. Bruno endured the pain without a sound. When Jack finished wrapping the wound, the shepherd rested his head against Jack's knee. For a long time they sat quietly beside the fire. The storm clouds gathered again outside the valley. Snow began falling slowly across the trees. Jack stared into the flames. He understood something now. The valley could protect them from the wind. The warm spring could help grow food. But survival here would never be easy. The mountains would test them again and again. Jack looked down at Bruno. The dog's breathing had steadied. His eyes were half closed, though he still watched the doorway carefully. "You saved me again," Jack said quietly. Bruno thumped his tail once. Outside, the wolves howled again somewhere far beyond the trees. But they did not return to the valley that night. And as the snow continued to fall, Jack Callahan realized something else as well. The first winter had only just begun, and it would nearly kill them both before it was over. The weeks that followed tested Jack Callahan in ways the war never had. Winter in the Sawtooth Mountains did not come in battles. It came in slow, relentless days that drained a man's strength little by little. The storms returned again and again. Snow piled high against the granite cliffs, sealing the valley deeper inside the mountains. The sky often stayed gray for days, the sun nothing more than a pale glow behind thick clouds. The small cabin Jack had built creaked under the weight of the weather. Inside, the fire burned almost constantly. Outside, the trenches carrying the spring water became the difference between survival and starvation. Each morning, Jack woke before the sun. His breath fogged in the cold air as he stepped outside to inspect the channels. Ice formed along the edges of the trenches overnight, but the warm spring water continued to flow beneath it. Steam drifted faintly where the current met the frozen air. Jack used a wooden shovel to keep the paths open. If the water stopped moving, the ground would freeze solid again. Bruno followed him through the snow, though the wound on his shoulder had not fully healed. The shepherd still limped slightly, but the injury had not broken his spirit. If anything, it seemed to sharpen his sense of duty. Bruno checked the forest line every morning, nose high, eyes scanning the trees. The wolves did not return, but other creatures did. Deer moved quietly through the forest after heavy storms, searching for exposed patches of grass near the warmer soil. More than once, Bruno froze suddenly near the edge of the valley. Jack would follow the dog's gaze and spot movement between the branches. Those moments meant food. Jack never wasted ammunition. He waited patiently, choosing his shots carefully. By the end of January, the small shelter had grown into something more permanent. Jack expanded the stone walls, sealing the gaps with mud and packed earth. Pine beams supported a roof covered with layers of bark and snow for insulation. It wasn't much to look at, but it was strong. Inside, the fire burned warmer now, the stone walls holding heat long after the flames died down. Jack had also built something else, a storage pit. Using the softer soil near the spring, he dug a deep cellar into the hillside. The ground there stayed warmer than the surrounding mountain, preventing the food from freezing completely. Rabbits hung from wooden beams. Strips of venison smoked slowly above the fire. It was still a fragile existence, but it was survival. By February, the first signs of real change began to appear. The trenches had expanded across much of the valley floor. Warm water flowed gently through the narrow channels, spreading heat through the soil. Where the water passed, snow melted into dark patches of earth. Jack planted small seeds he had carried unknowingly in his saddlebags. Beans, potatoes, and hardy greens meant for spring planting. He had little expectation they would survive, but the soil surprised him. Within days, the first shoots appeared, small, delicate, alive. Jack knelt beside them, studying the fragile leaves pushing upward through the winter soil. Bruno sat nearby, watching the forest. Jack shook his head slowly. "I'll be damned," he whispered. The valley was doing something extraordinary. It was protecting life when everything outside remained frozen. Spring came late that year, but when the snow finally melted in the lower valleys, Jack's hidden clearing already held something remarkable. Green. Rows of small plants covered the warmed soil beside the channels. The warm water from the spring kept the ground alive. Jack expanded the system throughout the summer. He widened the trenches, carefully guiding the flow of water across the valley floor. Stone barriers held the warmth where it was needed. The work never ended, but the results grew clearer each day. By the time autumn arrived again, the hidden valley looked very different from the place Jack had first discovered. A small barn stood beside the cabin. Jack had managed to capture 2 young calves that wandered into the valley during the summer months. Slowly, he began raising them in the sheltered clearing. A chicken coop stood near the stream. Jack had traded a smoked deer hide to a passing trapper months earlier for a pair of hens. Now the coop held nearly a dozen birds. Rows of vegetables grew in neat lines beside the warm trenches. Potatoes, carrots, beans, even hardy greens that refused to die in the cool mountain air. Bruno moved through the valley like a silent guardian. The shepherd had recovered fully from his injury. Each night, he circled the clearing several times before settling near the cabin door. Always watching, always listening. 3 years passed that way, season after season. Each year, the valley grew stronger. Jack expanded the irrigation channels. He built better stone walls. He reinforced the cabin with thicker timber. The hidden valley slowly transformed into something no one in Pine Hollow would have believed possible. A ranch, hidden deep inside the Sawtooth Mountains. Even in the heart of winter, steam rose gently above the warm channels that crossed the valley floor. Green plants pushed through the soil while snow covered the cliffs above. Cattle grazed in small fenced pastures. Chickens scratched at the earth beside the barn. And each morning, a gray-haired veteran walked through the quiet valley with a German shepherd at his side, checking the water channels that made it all possible. Jack Callahan had lost his ranch in Pine Hollow, but the mountains had given him something else, something better. A place no one could steal, a place no sheriff could claim. And far below those mountains, in the quiet valley town of Pine Hollow, people had no idea that the man they had cast out was building something extraordinary beyond the reach of their world. They would learn soon enough, because the winter that was coming next would break Pine Hollow in ways no one could stop. And when that happened, the only food left in those mountains would be growing in the hidden ranch no one believed existed. The first storm arrived in late November. At first, the people of Pine Hollow thought it was just another early winter snowfall. Snow had always come early to the valley, and the farmers were used to long seasons of cold. But this storm did not leave. For 3 days, the wind howled down from the Sawtooth Mountains. Snow fell without pause, piling against barns and fences, until entire fields disappeared beneath white drifts. When the clouds finally cleared, the valley looked like a frozen ocean. And the worst had not yet begun. Cold followed the storm. Not ordinary winter cold. A deep, punishing cold that settled into the land and refused to move. The temperature dropped far below anything Pine Hollow had seen in years. Water froze inside barns. Iron tools stuck to bare hands. Breath turned instantly to frost in the air. At Victor Hale's large ranch just outside town, the cattle began dying first. The animals could not reach the grass buried beneath the snow. The hay supplies ran out faster than expected, and the freezing winds drained what strength the herd had left. By the second week of December, dead cattle lay scattered across the valley. Victor Hale rode through his pastures in disbelief, staring at the animals he had once bragged about to every rancher in the county. Dozens were gone already, and the storms were only getting worse. Across Pine Hollow, the story repeated itself. Barn doors froze shut. Chicken coops collapsed under the weight of snow. Feed stores emptied quickly. Even the small farms that had survived earlier winters began to fail. In town, Ellen Parker watched the shelves inside her general store grow emptier each day. Flour sacks vanished first, then beans, then canned goods. People bought whatever they could afford, even if it meant spending money they did not have. Fear had a way of spreading quietly, the same way cold did. One afternoon, Sheriff Gordon Pike stood outside the bank with Leonard Shaw, staring across the frozen valley. Neither man spoke for a long moment. Finally, Shaw muttered, "This winter's gonna ruin half the county." Pike nodded slowly. "Maybe more." Even Victor Hale's ranch, the largest in the region, could not withstand the cold forever. Without cattle to sell in spring, the economy of Pine Hollow would collapse. Farmers who had borrowed money would lose their land. Businesses would close. The town itself might not survive. The realization hung in the air like the frost drifting from their breath. Weeks passed. Christmas arrived quietly that year. There were no celebrations in Pine Hollow, only the sound of wind rattling the buildings, and the constant worry that the food might run out before the snow melted. Children grew thinner. Families stretched every meal. Men who had once been proud ranchers stood silently in the streets, staring at the sky as if waiting for the storm to finally end. But it did not end. Another blizzard struck in early January. It buried the roads leading out of Pine Hollow completely. No wagons could leave. No supply shipments could arrive. The town was trapped. And with each passing day, the food stores dwindled further. One evening, Ellen Parker counted the last remaining crates in her store. A few sacks of flour, some dried corn, 3 jars of preserved fruit. Not nearly enough. She closed the ledger slowly. Across the room, several townspeople sat quietly near the stove, warming their hands. The silence felt heavier than the storm outside. "Maybe Victor Hale still has cattle left," someone said softly. Another man shook his head. "Most of them died last week." The room fell quiet again. No one mentioned the name that lingered unspoken in their thoughts. Jack Callahan. 3 years had passed since the sheriff forced him off his land. Most people believed he had died somewhere in the mountains. The Sawtooths had swallowed stronger men than him. Still, some in Pine Hollow remembered the day he left. A single rider disappearing into the snow with a German shepherd beside him. Ben Hollister remembered it clearly. That evening, Ben stood at his kitchen window watching the wind drive snow across the frozen fields. His wife stirred a thin pot of soup behind him. "You thinking about him again?" she said quietly. Ben nodded. "Jack was stubborn," he said. His wife glanced at him. "That man could survive anything." Ben didn't answer right away. He stared toward the distant mountains. They loomed dark and silent beyond the valley, their peaks lost inside the storm clouds. "Maybe," Ben said slowly, "but not 3 winters up there." Outside, the wind roared across Pine Hollow. Inside the town, hope was beginning to disappear. But far above the valley, beyond the frozen ridges and hidden cliffs of the Sawtooth Mountains, something very different was happening. Steam drifted quietly through the cold air of a narrow valley hidden between granite walls. Warm water flowed through carefully carved channels across the soil. Green plants pushed upward beneath the winter sky. Cattle moved slowly through fenced pastures. Chickens scratched the ground near a wooden barn, and near the center of that hidden ranch, a gray-haired veteran stood beside a wagon loaded with sacks of potatoes, crates of vegetables, and bundles of smoked meat. Bruno stood next to him, tail swaying slowly as he watched the valley below. Jack Callahan studied the distant mountains. The storm clouds over Pine Hollow were impossible to miss, even from miles away. He knew what that kind of winter meant. He had seen it before. Jack placed one last crate onto the wagon. Bruno jumped lightly onto the back beside the supplies. Jack climbed into the driver's seat. The old mule team leaned into the harness as he turned the wagon toward the narrow path leading down from the hidden valley. For 3 years, the mountains had hidden his ranch from the world. Now, for the first time since the sheriff forced him out of Pine Hollow, Jack Callahan was riding back toward the town that had forgotten him. And this time, he wasn't returning empty-handed. The wagon moved slowly through the mountain pass. Snow covered the trail in deep drifts, but the 2 mules pulled steadily, their breath rising in white clouds with every step. The wooden wheels creaked softly beneath the weight of the supplies. Bruno stood near the front of the wagon, his paws planted firmly as he watched the forest ahead. The German shepherd had traveled this path only once before, 3 years earlier. Back then, the trail had been empty. Now it carried something very different. Food. Crates of potatoes filled the wagon bed. Bundles of carrots and onions lay packed inside rough wooden boxes. Several sacks of beans and winter greens rested beside carefully wrapped bundles of smoked venison. Enough food to feed dozens of families. Jack kept the wagon steady as the trail descended from the high ridge. The mountains stretched out around him in silent white waves. For 3 winters, he had lived hidden inside them. 3 winters learning their rhythms. 3 winters building something that no one in Pine Hollow would believe. Bruno shifted suddenly, his ears lifted. Jack followed the dog's gaze. Smoke. Far below, beyond the snow-covered forest, thin columns of smoke rose into the gray sky. Pine Hollow. The town looked smaller than Jack remembered. Winter had buried much of it beneath snowdrifts. Barn roofs sagged under the weight. Fences had vanished beneath white fields. Even from the ridge, Jack could see how quiet the valley had become. The kind of quiet that came when people had nothing left to say. Jack guided the wagon down the final slope. By late afternoon, the wagon rolled slowly onto the main road leading into town. The first person who saw him was a young boy shoveling snow near Ellen Parker's general store. The boy stopped. His shovel slipped from his hands. For a moment, he simply stared. Then he ran toward the store door. Inside, several townspeople sat near the iron stove, trying to warm themselves. Ellen Parker stood behind the counter, writing numbers slowly in her ledger. The boy burst through the door. "There's a wagon coming!" No one looked up. Wagons rarely came anymore. The roads were too dangerous. "Full of food," the boy added breathlessly. That got their attention. Ellen lifted her head. "Whose wagon?" The boy shook his head. "I don't know." The room grew suddenly quiet. Everyone turned toward the window. Outside, the wagon rolled slowly down the street. Snow crunched beneath the wheels. 2 mules pulled the heavy load, and walking beside the wagon was a large German shepherd. Ellen stepped closer to the glass. Her eyes narrowed slightly. The man driving the wagon wore a thick coat and a gray beard now. But something about the way he sat in the seat felt familiar. Then the wagon stopped in front of the store. The man climbed down. The German shepherd jumped lightly from the wagon bed and stood beside him. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ellen whispered softly, "Jack." The door opened slowly. Cold air rushed inside. Jack Callahan stepped into the store. Bruno followed him. The room went completely silent. Every face stared at him. Some of them had not seen Jack in years. Others had believed they never would again. Jack removed his hat. The same quiet calm remained in his eyes. No anger, no bitterness, just the steady patience of a man who had learned to outlast difficult things. Ellen stepped forward slowly. "We thought—" She stopped herself. Jack nodded slightly. "I know." His voice sounded older now, but it carried the same quiet strength. Behind him, Bruno stood near the doorway, watching the room carefully. Jack gestured toward the wagon outside. "I brought food." The words hung in the air. No one moved at first. Finally, Ben Hollister pushed himself up from his chair. "You brought food?" Jack nodded again. "Enough to help the town through the rest of winter." The room filled with stunned silence. Ben walked slowly to the window. Outside, the wagon sat heavy with crates and sacks. Real food. Fresh vegetables. Meat. Things Pine Hollow had not seen in weeks. Ben turned back toward Jack. "How?" he asked quietly. Jack glanced briefly toward the mountains beyond the town. "It's a long story." The door opened again. Sheriff Gordon Pike stepped inside. Someone must have sent word. The sheriff stopped the moment he saw Jack standing near the counter. For a second, neither man spoke. 3 years had passed since their last conversation. 3 years since the sheriff delivered the notice that forced Jack from his land. Now the man he had driven away stood in front of him again, alive, and somehow stronger than before. Pike's eyes shifted toward the wagon outside. He saw the food. His expression changed. "You brought that here?" he asked. Jack met his gaze calmly. "Yes." "Why?" The question surprised several people in the room, but Jack answered without hesitation. "Because people are hungry." The sheriff looked around the room. The thin faces, the empty shelves, the worried eyes of neighbors he had known his entire life. He looked back at Jack. "You don't owe this town anything," Pike said quietly. Jack shook his head. "No." He glanced at the people standing behind the counter, the farmers gathered near the stove, the boy still holding his shovel in the doorway. "But they didn't take my land." The sheriff said nothing. For a moment, the only sound in the store was the soft crackling of the iron stove. Then Ellen Parker moved first. She opened the door and stepped outside toward the wagon. Others followed. Within minutes, the quiet street filled with movement. Crates were carried into the store. Sacks of vegetables were stacked near the counter. Someone opened a box of carrots and stared at them as if they were treasure. A woman began to cry softly. Bruno stood beside the wagon, watching everything carefully as people unloaded the supplies. Jack leaned against the wagon wheel and looked down the street. Snow drifted slowly through the air. Pine Hollow looked different now. Harder, more fragile, but still alive. Behind him, Sheriff Pike stepped outside. The sheriff stood there for a long moment before speaking. "Jack?" Jack turned slightly. Pike hesitated. Then he said quietly, "I didn't think you survived up there." Jack glanced toward the mountains. The hidden valley lay somewhere far beyond those white ridges, a place no one here could imagine. He looked back at the sheriff. "Neither did I," he said calmly. Bruno walked over and sat beside him. The German shepherd's tail brushed lightly against the snow. The sheriff studied the wagon again. "Where did all this come from?" he asked. Jack smiled faintly. "From a ranch," he said. Pike frowned slightly. "What ranch?" Jack looked back toward the mountains once more. Then he said quietly, "One you've never seen." The words hung in the cold air between them. Sheriff Gordon Pike studied Jack Callahan for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether the man in front of him was telling the truth or spinning some strange story. Behind them, the people of Pine Hollow continued unloading the wagon. Crates scraped against the wooden floor of the store. Sacks of potatoes thumped softly onto the counter. Someone opened a bundle of smoked meat, and the rich smell filled the room like a forgotten memory. It had been weeks since anyone in town had smelled real food. A young girl stared at a carrot in her hand, as if she had discovered something magical. Her mother wiped tears from her face while thanking Jack again and again. Jack didn't answer much. He simply nodded. For him, the moment felt quieter than it did for the town, because none of this had been the reason he returned. Bruno moved through the small crowd slowly, watching each person carefully. The shepherd allowed a few children to pet his thick coat, but his eyes never stopped scanning the room. Years of training had shaped his instincts, even here, even in a peaceful town. Jack stepped outside again. The sky had begun to darken with evening. Snow drifted gently through the street, settling across the wagon tracks. Sheriff Pike followed him onto the porch. For a while, neither man spoke. Then Pike said quietly, "You said that food came from a ranch." Jack nodded. Pike folded his arms. "There's no ranch up in those mountains." Jack looked out across the valley. The Sawtooth Range rose in the distance, blue and white beneath the fading light. "That's what everyone thinks," Jack replied. Pike shook his head slowly. "You're telling me you built a ranch up there?" Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt and scratched behind Bruno's ears. The dog leaned into his hand. After a moment, Jack stood again. "Not exactly built," he said. "Found the place first." Pike frowned. "What place?" Jack glanced at him. "A valley." The sheriff waited. Jack continued quietly. "Hidden between two granite walls. Warm spring coming straight out of the rock." Pike's eyes narrowed. "Warm water?" Jack nodded. "Doesn't freeze." The sheriff stared at him. "You're serious?" Jack's expression didn't change. "I ran channels from the spring across the valley floor." Pike blinked. "Channels?" Jack pointed faintly toward the mountains. "Water warms the soil, keeps parts of the ground soft even in winter." The sheriff stood silent. He had spent his whole life in Pine Hollow. He knew those mountains, or at least he thought he did. Nothing grew up there in winter. Nothing survived except trees and wolves. And yet Jack had just brought enough food to feed half the town. Finally, Pike said quietly, "You're telling me you've been farming up there? For 3 winters?" Jack nodded. Pike exhaled slowly. "I don't believe it." Jack gave a faint smile. "You're not the first." At that moment, the store door opened again. Ben Hollister stepped outside. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat. He looked from Jack to the sheriff. "Jack," he said slowly, "is it true what people are saying in there?" Jack tilted his head slightly. "What are they saying?" Ben hesitated. "That you've got a ranch hidden in the mountains." Jack met his gaze calmly. "Yes." Ben stared at him for several seconds. Then he looked toward the wagon, toward the crates still stacked along the porch, toward the people inside the store who were already preparing their first real meals in weeks. Finally, Ben asked, "Could a man see it?" Jack considered the question. Snow drifted softly through the air. The mountains beyond Pine Hollow were already fading into darkness. After a moment, Jack said, "Yes." Sheriff Pike looked surprised. "You'd show someone?" Jack nodded. "But only if they're willing to work." Ben frowned. "Work?" Jack's voice stayed calm. "I didn't build that place alone." He glanced down at Bruno, and it wasn't easy. Ben studied the older man. Jack looked different now. The years in the mountains had hardened him, but they had also done something else. They had given him a kind of peace Ben had never seen before. Finally, Ben nodded slowly. "I can work." Jack smiled faintly. "That's good." Pike looked between them. "You're serious about this?" Jack stepped off the porch into the snow. "Yes." The sheriff watched him carefully. "Why would you help anyone else build something like that?" Jack stopped walking. For a moment, he simply looked at the town. The dim lights glowing in windows, the thin smoke rising from chimneys, the quiet sounds of people finally cooking food again. Then he answered, "Because winters like this one aren't going away." Pike followed his gaze. The mountains loomed dark beyond the valley. "You think this will happen again?" the sheriff asked. Jack nodded once. "It always does." Silence returned. The wind whispered softly through the empty street. Inside the store, laughter began rising for the first time in weeks. Someone had started cooking soup. Bruno looked toward the sound and wagged his tail. Jack turned back toward the mountains. Tomorrow he would return to the hidden valley. But he would not be alone anymore. Because before the winter ended, Pine Hollow would learn the truth about the ranch hidden deep in the Sawtooth Mountains. And the man they once cast out would become the reason the town survived. The morning after Jack returned, Pine Hollow woke to a feeling it had not known in weeks. Hope. The storm clouds had thinned overnight. Pale winter sunlight spread slowly across the valley, glinting off the endless snowfields that surrounded the town. For the first time in months, the street in front of Ellen Parker's store was busy. People carried sacks of potatoes and bundles of vegetables home to their families. Children laughed while chasing Bruno through the snow. Smoke rose thickly from chimneys as warm meals finally filled the houses again. But the most surprising sight stood at the edge of town. Sheriff Gordon Pike. The sheriff waited there beside his horse, watching the road that led north into the mountains. Jack Callahan approached slowly, adjusting the straps on the mule harness of his wagon. Bruno walked beside him, tail moving gently in the cold air. Pike cleared his throat. "Jack." Jack stopped. The two men stood facing each other in the pale morning light. For a long moment, Pike said nothing. He was not a man who found apologies easily, but the winter had changed many things. Finally, he spoke. "I should have listened to you 3 years ago." Jack studied the sheriff quietly. "You were doing your job." Pike shook his head. "No." He looked toward the distant mountains. "I helped take your land." The wind moved softly across the open valley. Jack didn't respond immediately. Then he said calmly, "That land was already gone the moment I signed the loan." Pike frowned. "You still lost it because of us." Jack shrugged slightly. "Maybe." He glanced toward the mountains again. "But if that hadn't happened, I never would have found the valley." The sheriff followed his gaze. The Sawtooth Range rose in silent white ridges beneath the sky. "You're really taking people up there?" Pike asked. Jack nodded. "Anyone willing to work?" Ben Hollister stepped forward from the small group of townspeople gathered nearby. "I'm ready," he said. Behind him, two other farmers raised their hands quietly. They had lost nearly everything during the winter. Fields ruined, livestock gone. But they still had strength. Jack looked at them for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Bring shovels." The word spread quickly through Pine Hollow. Within days, small groups of men followed Jack along the narrow trail leading into the mountains. The journey was difficult. Snow still covered much of the path. But when the first group finally stepped into the hidden valley, they stopped in complete silence. The sight before them felt almost unreal. Green rows of plants stretched across the valley floor. Steam drifted gently from the warm irrigation channels. Cattle grazed calmly near wooden fences. Chickens scratched at the soft ground beside a barn. All of it alive in the middle of winter. Ben Hollister shook his head slowly. "I don't believe this." Jack smiled faintly. "It works." The work began immediately. Jack showed them how the trenches carried warm water through the soil, how stone walls trapped heat during the day, how the warm spring kept the valley alive when the rest of the mountains froze. The men listened carefully. They dug new channels, built new fences, expanded the warm fields across the valley. Bruno moved among them quietly, watching everything with patient eyes. Months passed. Winter finally loosened its grip on Pine Hollow. The snow melted slowly across the valley. Grass returned to the pastures. But things in the town had changed. Several new farms began appearing near the foothills, built using the same techniques Jack had discovered. Warm water irrigation, stone heat barriers, protected planting areas. People called them mountain gardens. They worked, even during harsh winters. And every year, a few more families learned the methods Jack had shared. The town slowly recovered. Years passed. One quiet evening, near the end of another winter, Jack stood on a ridge overlooking the hidden valley. The ranch had grown larger now. Several cabins stood along the stream. New irrigation channels stretched across the fields. Warm steam drifted into the evening air as the sun sank behind the granite cliffs. Bruno lay beside him. The shepherd's muzzle had turned gray with age. His movements were slower now, but his eyes still carried the same calm intelligence they always had. Jack sat down beside him. The valley below glowed softly in the fading light. "Remember when we found this place?" Jack asked quietly. Bruno thumped his tail once. Jack smiled. The wind moved gently through the pines along the ridge. Far below, the warm channels carried water through the fields, just as they had on that first winter. Jack rested his hand on Bruno's head. "You know something, old friend?" he said softly. "They took the ranch from us." Bruno looked up at him. Jack gazed out across the valley. "But the mountains gave us something better." The dog leaned quietly against his side. And as the evening light faded across the hidden ranch, Jack Callahan realized something he had not felt since long before the war. Peace. Bruno rested quietly beside him, the old shepherd's steady breathing blending with the soft sound of water flowing through the warm channels across the valley. Sometimes life takes everything from a man, only to lead him somewhere he never expected. Jack lost his land, but in the end, he found something no one could ever take away. If this story moved you, leave a simple comment below. You can even just type one if you believe loyalty like Bruno's still exists in this world. Or type 0 if you think stories like this remind us that no matter how hard life gets, a man can always stand up again. And if you're watching this from somewhere in the world, tell us where you're watching from. I read every comment, and it's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because the next story is already waiting. Another veteran, another loyal dog, and another journey that might change everything.